Okay, Zach. This is called a cold open. And I just wanted to come here in the beginning before we get started and say, this is going to be a fun one. Hello, hey, hola, and aloha. Welcome to the Forbidden Dinner Table. My name is Alex.
I'm Zach.
Now, Zach, to the untrained ear, my introduction there may have sounded like 3 languages, but it's actually 4. Because hey is how you say hi in Swedish. And why would I be speaking Swedish today, Zach?
I think we were going to cover a Swedish story.
That is correct. We have another story coming out of Sweden. Jag pratar lite svenska. And but that's just a tease. We're gonna I said I can speak a little Swedish.
Okay. I was lost. Thank you for translating for me and the listeners at home.
You're welcome. Everyone's confused. But that's just a tease. We're gonna hit that a little bit later. We got a couple things to start off with. Number 1. Now, Zach, I went and listened to our latest episode, and we actually spent a lot of time talking about learning and education, and I had this thought that's been kind of kicking around my mind, and I wanted to get your thoughts on it, and that's, have you ever thought about learning as simply creating a space to fail?
You know, when I kind of box it, when you talk about innovation, we talk a lot about at my work, like innovation. There was one person I worked under that had sort of a great mentality that whenever you kind of slap the innovation sticker, it's like a fail early, fail often. Like it creates a space where it's
okay.
Like we're going to go do a bunch of stuff and we're going to find out what doesn't work, kind of thing. So the Thomas Edison, like I haven't found a way to, invent the light bulb, but I found 10,000 ways that didn't work, and that's learning in its own way. I would say that like I think about the failure concept when you slap the word innovation associated with something.
That makes sense. And I think one of the best ways to learn is to actually like mess up and then do it right the second time. I was kind of thinking more of like, so an instructor is also good and that can sort of compound how quickly you learn something. But think about like even a classroom is just a safe space to fail.
Yeah, that's true. I think of like when I hear the terms intelligence and wisdom, I think an intelligent person is somebody who learns from their mistakes and doesn't keep repeating them. A wise person can learn from somebody else's mistakes.
Ooh, okay. I like that. Yeah. I was trying to kind of relate this to like golf, where if you're getting like an instruction, you're in a safe space. You can hit the ball. Like it doesn't even matter really what the ball is doing. You're focusing on other things, and that's where like an instructor can come on and help you, or the instructor could be YouTube or whatever, but you're trying things. Whereas like on the range in front of a lot of people, not necessarily a safe space to fail. Like if you start shanking it into the putting green, you're going to stop. You're going to be embarrassed. You might end up that practice session worse than you started. But if you're in a safe space to fail, that's how you get better.
Well, I would think about, this is going to sound weird, but like when you're on the golf range, I would consider that a safe space to fail within reason. Like you can shank them left and right if they've got the safety nets up, right? But if you're like popping it behind you or like 90 degrees to your left or right, then you're like a little bit of a menace to the range, right? So it's like you can try things that are exotic, but maybe not too exotic.
But even if you were trying to work on something and you were doing nothing but hitting it into the side net, wouldn't you kind of get embarrassed and stop?
A little self-conscious, yeah.
And I don't think that's good for learning.
That's true. You definitely need to be kind of low ego to learn.
Yeah, and I think creating a safe space helps with that too. Of like, because I've had golf lessons, and sometimes the instructor will be like, "I give you permission to shank this ball." Like that doesn't even matter right now, and it's weird to be told like, "Oh, you have permission to mess this up," and it kind of makes then you're not focused on that part anymore, and it's sort of a totally different environment, and you can just swing or do something different.
Yeah, it reminds me of when I switched my golf grip, and I knew like for the next 1,000 swings, like it was going to be a rough go at
hard,
it, right? But then you're rebuilding, and the thought is, okay, this is going to suck. But then it reminds me of sucking at something is the first step towards being good at something, and like
that's true.
You're trusting in the mentor, the advisor, that this is better long term, even though your next 1,000 golf swings.
Even like learning a language in a classroom or even like by yourself, very safe. You can just say the words, you can try to pronounce them. Whereas like if you don't know Swedish and you're in Sweden and you're trying to speak it, not great, because you're going to get embarrassed and you're going to be like, I don't even know if this is right. Not the right place to learn necessarily.
I'm going to put a footnote on that, though, because you need to have either like a good education system or a good teacher. Because imagine if you had a teacher who was correcting you, but what they were saying was incorrect.
So teacher can compound, I think, the learning and make it go even faster. But I think step one is creating a safe space to fail.
Yeah, but my point with the teacher is, though, let's say, for example, you've got a kid who's, I'm trying to think of just a claim. Let's keep it super simple. A kid who is like, well, the earth is round because 3,000 years ago, people, did measurements with shadows and stuff like that. And then you have a teacher being like, no, actually, that's incorrect. The earth is flat, right? Like, you can compound in the wrong direction is my point of even if you're in a safe space to fail, the definition of failure and correction can be problematic.
That's like saying practice doesn't make perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. Because you can be ingraining something that's detrimental or wrong.
I've never heard that before. I've heard practice with a purpose, so you're not just out swinging at the golf, back to
That's
the golf
good
range.
too.
Like,
yeah,
I that's something where on the golf course, I always make sure that I'm aiming at my practice shots, because if you're just swinging, how do you know whether you're doing good or not? But I've never heard
true.
Perfect practice makes perfect.
Yeah, because you could be, to stick with golf,
Building
you
bad
could
habits.
be correct. Yeah, that's basically what it is. And so that doesn't make perfect, but perfect practice would make perfect. Cool. Okay. Well, that was just a thought that I had. We've already spent more time on it than I thought that we would. Another thing that happened last episode is you put me in the hot seat and asked me a series of questions. So I came up with 3 questions to ask you. The purpose here is these are like fun getting to know you questions, but they're disguised as something else.
Ooh, I'm on a date with Alex right now.
Okay. So, question number 1. Zach, what question should I ask you?
Ooh. If I answer this question, then do I have to answer the question that I give you?
No, you
Okay.
don't.
All right, so here's a question that's fun. You have to do it with the right people. So maybe it's a getting to know you once you've known somebody for like a year and you want to get them knowing deeper is, what is the craziest, you can't explain it or just, thing that's happened in your life that you feel was otherworldly or irrational or just completely unexplainable?
That's a really good question. See, and you don't need to answer it, but maybe in a later episode we'll answer that.
Sure.
But what I'm more interested then is why you think that question popped into your head, or was that something you had answered recently or something like that? Or just...
Well, I think it gets people talking about stuff. If you can create, back to creating a little bit of a safe space, an area where you can get people talking about stuff that they may feel judged, or it gets them to really open up, and you may hear, there's so many crazy things about this world and just that we don't know about, like things from ghosts to ideas about aliens, all this sort of stuff. And if you can create sort of a space where somebody feels comfortable sharing that, I think you're going to hear some wild stories about just the human experience as well.
That actually makes a lot of sense. The purpose of that question was I could tell you, name a topic that you're interested in or that you could talk about right now, which is kind of what I asked. But if you phrase it as a question, you like freeze and your brain like doesn't know what to do with it, which you kind of just did as well. But if I were to be like, pick a topic to talk about, you could probably come up with one pretty fast.
Oh, yeah.
But if I ask, what question should I ask you? It's like, oh, that is backwards. That doesn't quite make sense.
This reminds me a little bit, slight tangent. So back when I was a staff manager at a bar and I was doing interviews, the last question that I would ask people was something like just a bonkers question that was kind of awkward and weird. And I cared less about your actual answer to the question and more about how you were going to react to the question. Because when you're a bartender, people come up to you and just say socially awkward or weird stuff or uncomfortable. Like people just, it's weird, it's late at night and all this sort of stuff. And I wanted to see how people could sort of think on their feet or move quickly. So I was watching for the process and how they handled getting asked an awkward question rather than the actual answer too.
That makes sense. I've heard interviews of people asking, like, how many marbles can fit in my office or something outlandish like that, and they don't care about an answer. It's never happened to me, but they just want to hear your thought process on going about solving it or answering something. And anyway.
Yeah. Part of the reason I came up with this too was when I was interviewing to work at the bar, the last question they asked me is, would I rather try and keep a turtle alive for 100 years or show Hitler's skull off in my living room without any bias in the showing of the skull?
What was your answer? Do you remember?
My answer was the turtle, and
I think I'd pick that too.
One of them kind of like quickly came back to me and was like, you think you could keep like a turtle alive for 100 years? And I was like, well, I had one as a kid. It didn't seem too hard. Was my answer.
That's good. All right. Question number 2.
Yeah.
Wario and Waluigi are portrayed as evil, villainous, or misunderstood characters opposite to our favorite heroes Mario and Luigi. If there was a Wario-type version of you, what would they be interested in?
First off, I thought there was going to be a theme to these questions, and I'm happy that
there is not.
The zigs and zags. I consider myself, or I try to be, an extremely rational person who can like think out loud, and you can follow my thinking. So I think a Wario version of me would be somebody who's just like widely irrational and leaps all over in their thinking.
That makes sense. My answer to this would be somebody that lives on a pineapple farm and is really into QAnon.
Why pineapple farm?
Because I don't like pineapples, so they seem like they would be obsessed with it.
I didn't know that about you.
Yeah, it's one of the few foods that I don't really enjoy.
This reminds me a little bit of the question, if you met the identical version of yourself in life, would you be extremely annoyed or love to hang out with that person?
That's a good question. I'd probably be both.
I thought of it too as like both, of like there'd be some things where I'd be like, this is so cool, we can hang out and talk about this stuff, but also I'd kind of, and this tells me a little bit about both myself and how I think of myself, if I was hanging out with myself, I'd kind of be like, just shut up, you're a little bit of a know-it-all, like stop talking and at the time.
I think I'd be like that too, and I'd also like, you need a little variety or a little opposites attract, right? Because if we're going to keep talking about all the things I'm interested in, I eventually would kind of get bored. I'd want to hear about something new, or music that I don't listen to, or a sport that I'm not really into, and I'd be interested to learn about it, but like that would never happen.
Yeah, definitely it'd be hard to get other variety or things that you just don't have in your purview. I do think like things that I would like in the version of me that I meet is I try to be very patient, I try to be very compassionate and sort of like inviting, and I think that'd be great to well, maybe it would just be a circle of me going, me to me being like, no, you go first.
No, you hang up.
Yeah.
Okay, great. And this last one is we're going to use as a jumping off point, but is it fair to say that you and I'm starting with this clarification, is it fair to say that you and I both dislike the far ends of the political spectrum, both sides?
Yes.
Okay, I agree. Now, which side do you think you hate more or dislike more, and why?
I don't know if I can answer that.
And I'm going to just say we dislike both. If you are simply right or left, we're not talking about you, so just calm down. But is there maybe one side that you dislike more than the other? Far side.
I'm thinking about it really abstractly, so there's not like a thing. Let me just walk you through a little bit of what's the case for disliking both sides.
Okay.
So some things about the extreme left is just annoying how sort of like in their face and outlandish that it seems. But also I think, the only thing constant is change. And so like in a country, when I'm thinking about over a span of like 1,000 or 2,000 years, there's just like an element of progressivism to it. So maybe we're just like way ahead of our times in terms of the extremeness that they're going out there, or trying to feel out in very progressive ways that eventually will get like shut down, but we'll find a very progressive way because that's how we sort of advance. So that's where I'm like, okay, it can be annoying with how outlandish it is, but also there's a purpose to it. When I think about the right, and like the extreme right, and I think about like they're trying to hold on to values that are super important to them, and maybe they're doing it just in outlandish ways almost of holding on to those, like the conservatism that they're trying to keep in this country. And so that they, at the heart of it, they care about something deeply, but then they start bending over backwards or going into conspiracy theories to try and uphold that. So I don't know if I can answer that.
Maybe what's interesting here is you took a very similar thought process to me. And so maybe let me answer and let's see maybe if it goes anywhere. So both sides are highly delusional, in my opinion. You have the far left that seems to be just throwing things at the wall and seeing what sticks. And the far right, like you said, wants to hold on and almost not change or go backwards sometimes. So my answer would be I just like the far right more because at least one side is throwing stuff at the wall.
Moving towards the progressivism and moving towards like we want to make change forward.
Correct, yeah. And not all of it's good, obviously, but at least one side is trying to progress, like you were saying. It's very similar, actually.
This is an oversimplification of it too, and I wouldn't stand by this completely, but like I think about the left being the heart of the nation and the right being the head sometimes, where the left is very good at identifying like where we need to care for people or change and like be more inclusive, especially when I think about things like just like living situations and rising house costs and all of that sort of stuff, and like caring for people and finding places for them to live, and they're pushing the UBI conversation and all of that sort of stuff. But I think the right it does a good job at times to step forward and say, well, hang on. We can't do a $25 minimum wage, right? Like we've got to talk about the basic economic policy here. We've got to talk about, the consequences to your actions. And so it's a constant back and forth, and together they build the nation. And that's how I like to think about it.
You certainly need both sides. But again, we're talking extremes. I had a thought at one point, I don't remember what this was based on, but it'd be very interesting if you could implement a government where the left comes up with ideas and the right implements them.
Well, I've heard if you want to build a really good system, build it in a way that with the idea when you build the system, you have to hand it over to the other side to run for 5 years.
Yeah, that actually is a good way to think about.
I think about it especially with immigration. Like I would love to get both into a room or like separate rooms and be like, design a system that then the other side is going to run for 5 years of how we're going to do immigration.
I like that a lot of things should be thought about that way of like, would you agree to this if it was your opponent? I mean, you and I have both talked about like ad hominem.
Yeah.
Just, the idea is the idea. It doesn't matter who said it or where it came from. And so it's sort of like that, just eliminating the political theater or the us versus them and just going, hey, here's an idea. If the other side said it, would you still be on board or no? Because then it's probably not that great of an idea if it's one way or the other.
Right. So my read, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that part of the reason the right takes you off so much is because they get like conspiracy theory and just outlandish. So the aggressive right, I should say. The far
yeah,
right.
but I was basing it more in one side wants nothing to change, and the other side throws things at the wall and sees what sticks.
Okay.
At least one side's throwing things at the wall.
Yeah. The problem, the counterweight to that is there are strong, good values in this nation that we want to uphold, and so I see that group as defending those values and making sure that we don't devolve into like chaos because there's these principles that they want to uphold.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I just look at how when things are when candidates are running, one side seems to have a list of things that they want to change and implement, and the other side, more or less, their whole running argument is like, we won't change anything, or we're not going to do that. And it's like, okay, but that's nothing. Like that doesn't get us anywhere.
Have I told you about my proxy test for whether or not I even go into the second level of looking at a candidate's kind of platform on the right or left?
I think so, but why don't you go ahead and lay it out?
Sure. So I as somebody who is a moderate or an independent and likes to hear the whole kind of like case of what somebody's viewpoints are and not just voting based on a color, I like to read the whole platforms of people before I go into an election. And in order to simplify it, because especially with like local elections, you've got a ton of stuff to read. If they're on the right, I go and take a look at what their views are on climate change. And if they're complete climate change deniers, I'm like, well, I struggle with this person's how they're gonna have a relationship with science, and so I'm worrisome about that. And that's my quick proxy test on the right. My quick proxy test on the left is to see if they have made any sort of outlandish comments about sex, like sex doesn't exist and things like that. Because then I sort of also weirdly think about like, well, what is your relationship with science? And like the reality, are you going so wokeism that you're just going to try and push a narrative that doesn't tie back to reality?
That isn't even logical at that point. Yeah, so I had heard the first part of that, but not the second part. So I'm glad that you laid it out, and that it's all about relating to logic, fact, science, these types of things.
Yeah, and relating, I mean, at the end of the day, what it kind of gets down to is you as one candidate are not going to do everything. So do I think you're somebody who's going to surround yourself with smart people and listen to those people?
That's smart too, yeah.
That's like the most important thing. Like, this is going to sound dumb, but like, do you work well with others? Like, that's kind of a huge indicator of whether because the president, yeah, they do a ton, but like their cabinet does a tremendous amount more than just the president.
Yeah, so it's really the whole package that you need to kind of look at.
Yeah.
And we'll use that as a segue because we have a sort of a breaking story here that we did want to talk about, which is Joe Biden talking about removing the filibuster. And I think, if I understand correctly, this is something that he's almost dangling to try and get more votes in the midterm, right? Saying that this will pass, or am I misunderstanding?
Well, I think because this is so breaking, there's a couple different perspectives out there, and I don't know if something's completely landed as to what is happening or is going to happen. But my understanding is people are concerned about voting rights. That's like a very hot topic thing. And so the Democrats are considering to get voting rights through, like a voting rights bill and updates to voting rights through. They're going to break the filibuster in order to put voting rights through. I think sort of on a move that is saying enough people care about voting rights that they're going to think that this is the right thing to do, and people are going to come out and back them because they improved the voting rights.
Do you know what they mean by voting rights? It seems so open-ended and arbitrary.
I know it has something to do with the fact that the Supreme Court dismantled the Voting Rights Act and stripped it of power. But I can't tell you line by line what
maybe we
exactly
should do some research and talk about that more. Because I read voting rights and go, it sounds good, but I don't know what that means.
Right, exactly that is. Yeah, and I've read commentary of like this, act or passage that was so powerful and that other people wanted to touch in the past. Like I just read that George Bush, had thoughts about the voting rights, but thought it was too sort of sanctimonious to touch. And then the people are very upset that the Supreme Court, basically these unappointed by the people individuals, went in and then stripped the voting rights passage of power.
I will say it seems silly to me that in a federal election, states handle it differently. That doesn't make sense to me.
Well, my guess is that's federalism at its core, right? When we're playing at the federal level, we have to play by these rules. But if you as a state want to have some slightly different rules about whether you mail out ballots to everybody or not, right? This is like the federal government saying the rule of you can have a localization and you can do what rules you want for your.
But if you're voting for the president, which is a federal role, that should be consistent, in my opinion. Now, if you're voting for like a state senator or a congressperson, that's fine. They can do them differently, but it gets a little weird when you have everyone across the country is voting for this person differently. Yeah.
Well, I don't know here of if there's a federal minimum standard of as long as you meet these 6 bullet points, then we'll consider your.
There probably is.
Election
and we just don't necessarily know what it is.
I know it's pretty crazy that so you vote, right? And you do the popular vote, and then that goes to a delegate, and then the delegate claims which candidate. There are 1 or 2 states where it is in the state constitution that the delegate has to vote the way that the popular vote goes in those counties. But otherwise it's kind of not required. The delegate can technically put in their votes for whichever candidate they want and break rank from the popular vote. It doesn't happen very often, but that's just bonkers to me that our system is actually built on this idea that there's just a historical standard or precedent that's what the delegates do is listen to the popular vote.
Well, it'd be chaos if they didn't.
Right.
I mean, imagine them going in and you're turning your back against your state then who's already sort of made a decision.
Right. It's just weird to me that that's not like fundamental.
I agree.
Like, it's
yeah.
required that you do that. Because I remember reading an article where they were saying what was the minimum amount of people that would have to vote for a president for them to carry with the Electoral College. They're trying to do the math to say like which states were the least populated but had the most votes, and what was the minimum number you could get somebody in on the president. And somebody wrote in and said the answer is 0. You could just have all the delegates turn out and say Rolf Nader.
Oh.
Right? You technically had 0 people vote.
Interesting. Yeah, that is odd. Do you have any personal thoughts on the filibuster before we segue out?
2 things. Number 1, I wonder if it's Joe Biden just kind of publicizing, like, this is what I want to do. I want to do this thing for voting rights. I want to do this for the Democrats. But he knows full well that either Joe Manchin or Kristen Sinema will never move on it. So he's just kind of blowing smoke to signal, to be like, this is what I care about.
Well, see, and I think that's him trying to drum up votes in the midterm.
Trying to get, basically saying like improve our numbers.
Democrats especially get excited, go out, vote, and we'll try and push this through. But if we lose, this is going to die.
Yeah. So I wonder if it's Biden just sort of saying, hey,
which is fine.
This is what I want to do.
Good strategy.
This is the game. This is politics.
Yeah.
The other thing I think of is if they legitimately are going to work with Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema to actually overturn the filibuster, it seems like weird timing that you're about to take off the guardrails potentially when things are going to swing to the right, and then you are handing the Republicans a Senate that just moved from a 60 vote like a 60 vote threshold to a 50 vote threshold, and then the right is just going to walk a bunch of stuff through and dismantle what the left's been working.
Well, that's why I think this is they're dangling this in front. They need to make sure that they get the votes, and then they'll try to put it through. If the right comes out like it kind of seems like it's going to happen and changes some of these seats, this will just go away. Yeah. In my opinion. So it's a carrot to get people out and voting, which again is fine.
Part of the game.
Yeah. So I agree. And I would like to see it go away, because then I was telling you earlier, it feels like our government has barely done anything in the last maybe 20 years. I mean, you can name maybe 5 big ticket items, but it seems like most stuff just dies. And I think this is a big reason why.
Well, yes and no. I understand that viewpoint, how it feels like we're always in gridlock, but the reason that it's in there is so that you don't have massive swings every 2 years of legislation of like, as the, let's say you're bouncing around that margin, like we have been, where we went to the right, now we're left, and it's 50-50. Like, you just can undo a bunch of legislation, and then in 2 years it gets undone again and goes back, and it's meant to create stability in how laws are passed, so that you need a little bit more than just that 50% to keep things going. Like, I did really worry about this. It seems like it's kind of calmed down now, but like, especially because I work in healthcare, of like, if there was going to be the skinny repeal of the Affordable Care Act, and then, because the right, Trump seemed to be moving at a time to be like, he was going to go after healthcare. Healthcare was going to be sort of his new big ticket. And I was like, oh boy, are we going to just be this pendulum that goes back and forth changing healthcare regulation every 2 years? But it didn't seem to pan out.
Yeah, I feel like there's other ways though to ensure that maybe that doesn't happen. But maybe that gets more difficult too. That you can't repeal something until 5 years, or there might be other rules you could make.
Here's the thing, Al, though. You write that rule in, and now that there's no rules in writing the rules, you can change the rule. That's the problem. Like, if you're like, okay, we're going to make this so the rule is you can't repeal this over 5 years, the new guys come in and go, well, all right, we can write a rule that overdoes that rule because we have the power.
Yeah, you're right. I just hope people would behave differently. But, that is true. It's certainly a tough one. It's one of many things too, where it's like, well, I can kind of see both sides, I guess. But
definitely, I will say one thing that you kind of taught me recently was, I used to be way more into politics. I still follow it and try to keep just the pulse on what's happening nationally and try to do it locally too. But I think you've taught me a good skill of like, when things are just kind of going crazy or you hear these just wildly outlandish stories, instead of getting mad, you just laugh and you go, well, that's absurd.
That's my new thing. Yeah, because I agree. A couple years ago, I would have started to get upset and go read about it all and all this. And now I just go, that's so silly.
Yeah.
That's what they're proposing? That's so funny.
Say, yeah. Like, this is what we want to do? Wow. Let's see how that plays out. Like, instead of being like, this is ridiculous and I need to, drum up all these people. And maybe that speaks of a place of privilege that we are in, that there's nothing like, I don't have family that's trying to make it across on visas or something like that. But
it does, but all you can do is vote anyway, really. I mean,
that's true.
Getting mad about it and reading about it doesn't change anything. I guess you could go protest and vote. So if you're going to spend energy, do those two things, and I would support you. But to get angry and argue with people and react, it's like, nah, just, that's so silly. That's what they're proposing? That's hilarious. You see what happens, I guess. That's my new take.
Yeah. It reminds me a little bit of, I think it's a Winston Churchill quote where he said, the greatest argument against democracy is a 15-minute conversation with the average voter.
That's a good quote. Yeah, that's funny.
So, yeah.
All right, cool. Well, that buttons that one up a little bit. We're going to move along here. We had a story. This is a little bit old now, but there was a story out where China's lunar rover had seen some interesting structure, or they weren't really quite sure what it was, on the moon. And so there's a big story about, well, what's it going to be? They're going to go investigate. Turned out it was nothing special. But a comment on the story really got my mind running, and this is where I kind of want your thoughts. So the comment was something along the lines of, do you think China would ever essentially make this stuff up and then use it as a discovery or some sort of science, I put that in quotes, backed thing that would then like directly go against a more Western belief? So for example, and this is going to be outlandish, but so for example, it turned out that this thing on the moon was an alien's house, and the alien said this particular religion is correct, and it happened to be a more Eastern one. Does that make sense?
Yeah, basically, would China try to like sow doubt in Western belief systems
using
to cause
science?
Chaos? Almost like how the Russians have done with Facebook, where they're causing like basically some type of level of chaos from a political standpoint, but would China try and do that on a scientific front to...
Yeah, not only on a scientific front, but use their space program, like something well regarded, because I mean, everything's CCP, right? So some sort of well-known, well-regarded organization within that. So I don't know what their space program is called, but their version of NASA, and say, you're going to put this out there that we found this, and it directly goes against some sort of Western belief.
A couple things. One, just a comment on the original story of the moon rover who that needed to drive for like a couple months. My first thought was, does nobody have a telescope they can swing 1 degree to look at that rock? To just be like, zoom in, enhance. Nope, we're good. You don't need to drive over there.
Keep it where it is. It's fine.
Yeah, that was my first thought.
Good question.
Secondly, so would China ever sort of drum up this scientific thing? I would say no, and here's why. Because they're going to make some type of claim on a sciencey or space front, and then the USA would basically, if they're like being personally attacked, I think if they're going to try and go, instead of just like a low road slander against China, they would, if they were smart, I think, recreate the scientific claim, or like go drop their own lunar rover, right, and go over and show like, no, this is wrong. And now the rest of the world has to weigh on a side, China versus the USA. However, the claim hopefully would be easily testable. So let's just put the EU as player 3 here. They're going to go take a look at the scientific claim as well. And now China is going to lose a ton of credibility at the world stage.
That's true. Do you think the damage would already be done, though, if it was something monumental?
It's a short-lived game. So I don't know how long. I mean, it would probably take years to build a lunar rover and send it over there. Like whatever. Let's just say you have to build a giant collider or something like that. For that time period, you might cause a lot of damage. But when you get the rest of the world to align that China is either lying knowingly or just erroneously performing science, Now you're going to have the rest of the world swing back against China.
And probably be even harder to earn all that back.
Exactly. Right? So I think the trick is, I'm taking the question specifically through like a science lens, like would they use science? And science has such a methodical process to it that it can be replicated. That's kind of like the whole point of science. Other parties can replicate it, see that China is playing some type of misinformation game, and China would lose a bunch of credibility on the world stage.
That does make sense. Yeah, they would be shooting themselves in the foot long term, I suppose. Mm-hmm. Now, if they had people go on Facebook and start posting about what they think it is and all that, that's kind of something different. But
well, okay, so if China can't play externally, what they're going to do is play internally, which is what you see. They have massive information censorship and control over their own people, where, I mean, like Google is, I don't think, in China anymore. LinkedIn pulled out, like a ton of those massive companies because of all of the rules that the Chinese government has. So China basically is playing this game at an internal level where they can control the Chinese.
Yeah, but the story or the question was more about the information coming out of China.
Out of China. Yeah. See, I think China is smart enough to know that when they're playing in an external outside of they have to play by the kind of worldly rules, and then behind their doors they get to do.
That does make sense. Yeah. It was just something I read and thought, I never really considered that before, about trying to dismantle, could be religion or some sort of societal structure, belief, through like a discovery that they kind of make up.
Yeah. Can I do a quick fun little tangent on Chinese? So when we think about our keyboards, right, we like think about like a digital keyboard, and like when you're swiping or doing autocorrect or predictive text and things like that. That was an incredibly hard problem for China to solve because their alphabet is completely different when you think about characters and things like that.
Yeah.
And I don't understand the Chinese language enough to know how they intelligently cracked actually making a digital keyboard for the Chinese language. But I do know that it operates at sort of at a massive state level in a really interesting way, where when people are using the characters and whatnot, and it's being predictive about what your next character or word is going to be, it takes what is happening in the world and what is happening in China from like a cloud, the amount of data that's coming in, and it will change the predictive text based on what is like going on in the news.
That's interesting.
You can also use that to sort of lead people down different sentence paths, if that makes sense. So there's a concern of like, is the China, just that what you're typing on the internet can be skewed by the amount of data that's coming in and the narrative that you want to push somebody in.
That is really interesting. I've never thought about a Chinese keyboard before, and how even that sounds like it would be difficult just because the language is so much different.
It took years, is my understanding, to come up with a way to digitally do the Chinese language.
I might look into that. That sounds like, I want to see an example. Not that I would understand the characters, but if someone could like talk through it, that would be kind of cool.
Well, see, I don't have an example, but it was a podcast. I can't remember if it was radio. I think it was Radio Lab, where they go through the story of it. It's either Radio Lab or Vox. And I remember being like, this is about keyboards. This is going to be boring. And then by the end, I was like, I've learned so much.
That's like, it turns out the podcast about the Supreme Court cases is one of the most interesting ones I've ever listened to.
That's my favorite podcast of all time. Yeah,
more perfect. Who knew? Yeah. All right, cool. Now, we're finally going to go to Sweden, Zach.
Ooh, yeah.
Get ready for some meatballs and some lingonberries. Well, this is actually the second time we've been here, but this story, you'll see why I paired it up then with the last one. So Sweden has officially created a psychological defense agency. So this is like almost part of the military is what this sounds like. And the sole purpose is to identify and respond to inappropriate influences and other misleading information directed at Sweden or Swedish interests. And I think this is fascinating because this is almost like the next level of what warfare could potentially turn into. Now, I know we just made the Space Force, but I'm almost thinking like this is actually where we should be spending almost all of our time, is stuff like this.
So I have not read this article yet. I'll say this. One quick comment on the Space Force thing. I thought it was a little bit silly until somebody pointed out to me that so much of United States military and day-to-day just like even at a civilian level, relies on satellites. And basically the Space Force
Yeah.
at the end of the day is a defense layer on the satellites.
I get it, I guess. In a way, it seems like it feels premature, but it's probably not actually, really. That stuff is important and needs to be protected. But I think this is almost
imagine if we
equally
lost
important.
GPS. Imagine if the U.S. lost GPS capability.
Yeah.
You shrug your shoulders, but think about shipping, right? From like ships
true.
and navigation of
Flights.
trains and planes, and
That's a good point.
all of that sort of stuff would go down. And it's kind of like, I don't remember if we were talking about this on air or not. It's crazy to me to think that no time in human history has there been so much built around this layer of something that could go out and like crash a society.
I think about that a lot. Yeah.
Right. Like the only other thing I could think of, which is a totally different ballpark, is like sunlight. Like for like millions of years, we all relied on sunlight for farming and stuff like that. And if that went out, we'd be doomed. But like the idea that we have built like the internet and electricity as so much of a common necessity that if that goes out, it's not like it would all end, but there would be chaos.
Well, the crazy thing too is as we put chips in more and more and more things, like even your fridge might break. Potentially, because not mine personally, but they have fridges with chips in them and stuff like that. So something could go wrong, or that could get hacked, or something like that.
Yeah.
And I had another.
Get out your ice box. If you want to keep anything cold.
Yeah, but like in today's world, like that, you wouldn't even know where to start.
Right. Yeah, that's what's wild too. Is so much is stored. Like people would be like, okay, my refrigerator broke. I'm going to need to Google. Well, can't Google. Okay.
Yeah,
like
that's true.
are-
Yeah, I mean, you'd think that with something so critical, there's backups on backups and things.
Yes,
and this,
that is true.
Like we've probably, I hope, created a scenario where it almost can't go down permanently. But
And I'm guessing too that if layer 1, 2, and 3 breaks, there is, I don't know, maybe 50 scientists in the United States who have a binder in their library that if like layer 3 breaks, everybody grabs the binder and grabs a like motorcycle that's before, like all those scientists have a motorcycle before the 70s that doesn't have a chip, and they have a plan to go meet up in Maine and like start like.
This was a
the,
thing.
The government has layers to the level of deep analog in case things.
This was a thing. I'll have to double check this, but I want to say they had like certain radio shows or something that had like a book that if this was during the Cold War, right? So if there was some sort of attack or missile problem, there was like a book that these radio stations could go to and start talking about like where to go, where the safe spaces were. They like had this figured out.
I know the U.S. They had a basically nuclear fallout conversion plan for all of the government agencies. Like, so if there was a nuclear fallout or like a missile did come down, the park services and park rangers would immediately turn into like refugee camp employees, and they would use the park service land as getting camps of people, and then the post office would become the like door-to-door confirm whether you're alive or not, because they have everybody's addresses. Like they
have contingency plans.
Yep, a contingency plan. Like when the missile falls, boom, you fall. Like you switch over into this now need or function for society as we rebuild.
That's cool. Yeah, there's a cave here in Texas that you can tour, and they talk about how it was a designated shelter. They had barrels of food in there. In fact, they still like have one as a prop. Like you can see what it looked like and all that. And they were just in there ready to go just in case. They had lighting and electricity and all this kind of stuff to use it as a fallout shelter. Like that, it was planned.
The crazy thing to think about, and somebody pointed out, I think it was another podcast I was listening to where I learned all this, is all of this is in place not to ensure that you survive, but that America survives.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, right.
It's not like obviously it is to try and save as many lives as possible, but like it's kind of accepting that a ton of people will die in this missile fallout, but how do we make sure that America?
It's a big continuity plan. Don't they have a plane too that takes off and they put important people on it and it just flies around to like be safe?
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it got, I want to say once during the Trump presidency, it got like scrambled and they launched it. It's They take important members of the government and stick them on this plane that just flies around, and it's super secret and stealth and all that kind of stuff, but it just gets them out of
turmoil,
DC or turmoil, wherever they are. Yeah, and it just removes them from the equation. It's almost like that designated survivor.
Big designated survivor. That's exactly what I was thinking too. Of
yeah.
when there's a big government meeting.
They have those. They have those plans. Yeah, those are kind of real. I've never seen the show, but and this is why this. To go back to the article here, so both are equally important then, almost as some sort of space force. But I've thought about how we haven't really had a big physical conflict since World War II. There's been little things here and there, but if we were to have some sort of big World War III, so much of it would strictly be information, attacks, campaigns, hacking. I mean, cyber. You could fight a whole war without firing a bullet. Mm-hmm. I've had a thought, like, how would you invade another country right now? Through the phone line. And start with that.
This is why the federal government had to step in with, I think it was the National Defense. I could be wrong about that. Do you remember the ransomware attacks that locked up like the pipelines in America and stuff like that?
Yep.
The federal government thought about coming out and making it illegal for companies to pay for like their data back, or like to pay the ransomware hackers. I don't think they did this, but the thinking from the federal government was, if you make it illegal to pay the ransom, then there's can prosecute people. Yeah, then there's no point for the ransomware attackers to hold people's hostage, because the federal government would step in and be like, nope, they're not paying for their data because that's illegal.
That's an interesting thought.
They ended up not doing that, but there was an idea floated to say, we got to somehow cut down on this ransomware attacks, because exactly what we're talking about, cyber attacks and stuff like that, is the totally new way for warfare.
It's the new missile. Yeah, I mean, that's all you really need to do. And the other side of this coin, though, at least for here in the U.S., this all sounds well and good. You have a government agency fighting disinformation and all that kind of stuff. But how quickly do you start to question they're only letting this through and not this? And it seems also like a very easy target for conspiracy theories and those types of things.
Yeah.
You're picking and choosing information. I actually asked Dave Rubin this question, and he answered it. But my question was, how do you have a centrally run media or a state-run media without looking like it's slanted or one-sided, or that we have, some sort of government narrative being pushed? And that's kind of what this is in a weird way. This is like a filter, but it's tough, because you almost could say, well, this Swedish Psychological Defense Agency is going to play it really close to its chest about what it's kind of blocking or not. But then you run into the problem of not having transparency with the people. Yeah, right. It's interesting you said, so yeah, that'd be one way to do it, is play it very close to your chest. The other way to do it is the second thing you said, which is be super transparent. This is what we blocked and why. This is what we blocked and why. And I think that's true. I mean, if our government did that, I mean, look at the pandemic. If they said, this is the reason and here's why every single time, instead of just new rule, I think people would have a lot more faith in the system.
Maybe. I'm just imagining like a Swedish military leader who like picks up the phone to Russia or China and says like, "Yoo, please stop doxing us."
Could you retract that article, please? Yeah, that's true. But yeah, I just thought it was interesting. It's almost like the next branch of the military, right? So we had Space Force, and now it's going to be like Information Force or something like that.
Yeah, I'm just kind of glancing at the article now. It says for the Swedish Psychological Defense Agency, its 45 employees will work with the military, media, universities, and government to help the population learn how to detect and resist influence campaigns and disinformation.
So that's even better, though, if it's rooted in like education. They're not necessarily
I think that's good.
Pulling things down. I'm sure they would, but it's mostly education.
What I hear from that, though, is a little bit sad that people have lost their way in critical thinking skills about disinformation. Oh,
that should be no surprise. Again, look at the pandemic.
It's not a surprise to me. It's just sad.
It is sad. That is true. Well, that's why we spent a whole bunch of time on this show talking about like our own personal filters and how we take information and try to make sure that it's from a good source, or what sort of things questions we might ask, and make sure that it really is good information.
Well, this is just my whole argument against censorship too, though, is like you have to keep these skills sharp. You can't censor a bunch of information and let people, then when people do have to think for themselves, they've lost the ability to have these filters and things that these developed skills that say,
that's true.
What is, I believe Carl Sagan called it the baloney detection kit. And he's got like 10 rules that you run an idea through.
That's what we should have called our episode that we talked about it. The baloney detection kit.
Yeah. Carl Sagan wins again.
Cool. Yeah. Just some things to think about. Any other stories? Anything else in the news you want to discuss today?
Nothing comes to mind when I logged on and real quick and just briefly glanced at the news. I remember thinking about when I was, maybe this was like 15 years ago. I probably was in early high school, learning that like goodnews.com or something like that existed. And I was like, why is there just a website that has only good news? And here I am like years later being like, I finally understand it. People get sick of just, this many people died today and this shooting and this recall from an elevator, because that's what I saw a story today. There was like an at-home elevator company had to be recalled because it's like there was a risk of kids dying in the elevator, and I was like, man, there's just no good news.
But I think about that a lot, and I don't think those sites or those stations, whatever you want to call it, I don't think they survive, because fear is captures and holds your attention so much more.
Yeah, this is the fact that disgust is an incredible tool, and why false Facebook articles get shared way faster than legitimate ones, because people are so easy to, when they get disgusted, they want to share that out.
Think about,
it's a tool.
So we had January 6th anniversary. I don't know if you paid attention to the news that day at all, but it was nothing but that. I mean, there's been some stations where it seems like it's been a year now that's all that they talk about, because that was like their best day for ratings, and they won't let it go. And so, they could be running all these different stories. There's so many interesting things going on. We had turmoil in Kazakhstan, Afghanistan is having problems, but no, we're going to talk about January 6th. And that's just because people get angry and it holds their attention. And so that, I don't blame them, but it is sad to go back to your point.
Have you ever seen the movie Nightcrawler with Jake Gyllenhaal?
Yes.
Great movie. Really good. Jake Gyllenhaal's great in it. But there's a scene where, and this is a fictitious movie, but there's a scene where they're covering a super violent, like at-home break-in and killing, and there's like an earpiece in the newscaster's ear, and they're like feeding them specific lines about like how to basically talk up the story to be the most like juicy or sort of inflammatory and like mention that this is like a white neighborhood, like just sort of that sort of stuff. I don't know if they exactly do that neighborhood, but like they are just manufacturing the way to get people to sort of be disgusted, outraged, and want to share. Which
is exactly why I stopped watching all of that, because you have to realize that it is manufactured. That doesn't mean the story's not true, but the slant is usually completely manufactured. Or the little things, what they leave in, what they leave out, it's all manufactured. So if you can find independent news, you're usually a lot better off.
Yeah, I remember you sent me one time a news story, and the whole claim from the site was that there was no opinion part of the news at all, like it was just facts. And I was constantly surprised how short the articles were, because it was just like boom, boom. These
happened
things
today.
Happened.
Yeah,
right. And you're like, I remember reading it, and there being a moment where I was like, I don't know how to feel about this. And that's really good that there's not this piece that's packaged up to be like, this happened and here's how you should feel about it.
Yeah, that site ended up turning out to be more right wing. But when it was first started, that was the whole point.
Yeah. And there was short articles, and I was like, wow, this is a different take.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. And it is sad that those things, it's sad that you brought this up once too, that those would all go away if we stopped watching, but they're bigger and better than ever. And that's like, then that's disappointing too.
Yeah. I call that the People magazine, the tabloids.
Right. Exactly.
You keep buying them.
Yep.
Yeah. So, you know what? Here's my takeaway. Here's my call to action.
Yeah, let's close it up for us here, Zach.
when you see people talking about the news, or when you're out looking for news and you find like a cheerful story or a good news story, let that one be the one that you like bring up or talk about, and like
That's
bring
good.
forth one.
Share.
Yeah, the one that you share, the cheerful story.
I like that.
That's gonna be my goal for the week, is when people start talking about the news or start talking about the weather, because those are like the two things that come up when you're at the beginning of a conference call. I'm gonna be like, did you see that this wonderful thing happened?
Well, that's like asking. I read somewhere that rather than how are you, how's it going, blah 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 blah. Something you can ask somebody is just like, hey, what's good, or what are you looking forward to, or tell me an achievement or something you accomplished recently. I mean, the tools are there for us to use and drive the conversation that way. It's just that we never really seem to do it.
Yeah, not a lot of times, but the few times that we're just sort of sitting in silence, I'll come off mute and ask people if anybody could have a superhero power, what would it be? And that gets the people talking.
That's good. Yeah, cool. Thank you for buttoning it up for us. So that is going to do it. If you are still with us, we really appreciate you. Please remember to follow, like, subscribe. We are on Spotify and YouTube. And you can, as always, email us at forbiddendinnertable@gmail.com. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you. Have a great week. Have a great night.